The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day the old pine tree at the edge of Abigail Hale's property split clean down the middle from a bolt of lightning, and she would later think that maybe the universe had been trying to tell her something about things breaking open to let the light in. It was the spring of 1882, and the town of Millhaven, Texas, sat baking under a sky the color of old brass, the kind of sky that made even the most optimistic souls squint and wonder if the rain would ever truly come back. Millhaven was not a remarkable place. It had a general store run by a man named Everett Cole, who was generous with credit and stingy with conversation, a saloon called the Dusty Spur that smelled of pine resin and old whiskey, a church with a bell that swung but rarely rang true, and a post office housed in the back corner of the livery stable because the postmaster, a wiry gentleman by the name of Chester Pratt, also kept horses and saw no reason to maintain two separate establishments when one would do. Abigail Hale was 24 years old, and she lived alone on 12 acres of dry, stubborn land that had once belonged to her father. Her father, Thomas Hale, had died 2 winters prior of pneumonia that crept in fast and left no room for negotiation. Her mother had gone before that, when Abigail was 17, taken by a fever that swept through Millhaven like a rumor and left 3 families smaller than they had been before. Abigail had no siblings. She had a mule named Crockett, a garden that produced more determination than actual vegetables, 2 laying hens, and a rifle she knew how to use but preferred not to. She was not beautiful in the way that made men stop talking in the middle of sentences. She was something quieter than that. She had brown hair she kept braided back because loose hair in Texas wind was a practical problem more than anything else. She had green eyes that were clear and direct, the kind that made people feel she was paying attention to them even when she was thinking about something else entirely. Her hands were rough from work. Her boots were worn at the heel. She owned 3 dresses, one of which she considered good enough for church, and the other 2 of which she considered good enough for everything else. She was not what people in Millhaven would call a prize. She was what they would call capable, which in their vocabulary was a compliment, but not the kind that made a woman feel seen. It had been her neighbor, Mrs. Clara Dutton, who had first suggested the correspondence arrangement. Mrs. Dutton was 61 years old and had outlived 2 husbands, and appeared to have found in their absence a calling for matchmaking that she pursued with the enthusiasm of a woman who had nothing left to lose. She had come over one April afternoon with a jar of peach preserves and a newspaper clipping. "There is a rancher up in Harding County," Mrs. Dutton had announced, setting both the jar and the clipping on Abigail's kitchen table with equal ceremony. "His name is Levi Hartwell." He placed an advertisement in the Abilene Gazette seeking correspondence with a sensible woman of good character. His wife passed 2 years ago. He has a son, 7 years old. He is 28. Abigail had looked at the clipping. It was small. It said, "Rancher 28, widower, honest means, son age 7, seeks letters from sensible, good-natured woman of any station. No pretense required. Write to L. Hartwell, Harding County, Texas, via the Cassidy Creek Post." She had set the clipping back down. "Clara, I am not a mail order anything." "It is not an order," Mrs. Dutton had said, unruffled. "It is a letter. People write letters all the time. It does not obligate either of you to a single thing. It is just words on paper." "Words on paper have a way of becoming things," Abigail had replied. "Yes," said Mrs. Dutton, smiling. "That is rather the point." Abigail had not written the letter that week. She had put the clipping in the drawer beneath the kitchen window, the one that stuck in the summer heat and had to be shouldered open. She had gone about her business. She had planted beans, mended a section of fence that Crockett had tested with his considerable stubbornness, traded 2 dozen eggs for a sack of cornmeal at Cole's General Store, and gone to church on Sunday where the sermon was about patience, and she had sat in the 3rd pew from the back and thought about the clipping in the drawer. She had written the letter on a Thursday night, 3 weeks after Mrs. Dutton had left it. She had sat at the table with the lamp turned up, and she had gone through 4 attempts before she had settled on one that felt honest without being pathetic. She had written, "Mr. Hartwell, I am writing in response to your advertisement in the Abilene Gazette, which a neighbor was kind enough to share with me. My name is Abigail Hale. I am 24 years old and I live alone on a small plot of land outside Millhaven, Texas, where I have been since my father passed 2 years ago. I will tell you plainly that I am nothing special. I am not wealthy, not particularly well educated beyond what the schoolhouse in Millhaven provided, not beautiful in any exceptional sense, and not in possession of any remarkable skills beyond keeping a house in reasonable order and a garden in unreasonable defiance of the Texas soil. I do not say this to discourage you. I say it because your advertisement asked for no pretense, and I have found that honesty at the beginning saves a great deal of trouble later. I can cook, I can work, and I mean what I say. If that is of any interest, I would be glad to continue writing. Sincerely, Abigail Hale." She had folded it, addressed it, and walked it to Chester Pratt's post office the following morning before she could change her mind. Then she had gone home and largely tried to forget she had done it. Levi Hartwell received the letter on a Monday afternoon. He had been working the south fence line since before sunrise, and he came in at noon with his shirt dark with sweat and his hands sore from the wire stretcher. And Domingo, his ranch hand of 6 years who was also his closest friend in the world, had handed him a small stack of mail from the hall table without looking up from the harness he was mending. There were 4 letters. 2 were from suppliers. One was from his late wife's mother in Missouri, which he set aside to read later and with a degree of bracing. And one was from Millhaven, Texas, from a name he did not recognize, in handwriting that was neither elaborate nor careless but rather exact. He read it standing in the hallway, still in his work clothes. He read it a second time. He carried it to the kitchen and sat down at the table and read it a third time. He set it flat on the table and looked at it for a while. His son, Noah, came in from the yard trailing dust and wanting to know if there were biscuits left from breakfast. Levi told him yes, they were under the cloth on the counter, and watched his son eat one standing at the counter, which Levi usually corrected, but did not this time because his mind was elsewhere. There was something about the letter that he could not put down. He had received 11 letters from women in response to his advertisement. He had placed the advertisement on the advice of his brother, who lived in Dallas, and had the kind of easy confidence about other people's lives that comes from not living them. Levi had not expected much from the advertisement, and the 11 letters had largely confirmed his low expectations. They had been composed with a careful cheerfulness that felt like a performance. They had listed accomplishments. They had mentioned their church attendance and their domestic capabilities in the tone of a sales ledger. 2 had included photographs taken at considerable care. Abigail Hale's letter had none of that. It had instead something that he could not precisely name, but recognized the way you recognize a particular quality of light on an autumn morning. Not something you could describe to someone else, but something you would know absolutely when you saw it again. She had said she was nothing special. She had said it first. She had put it right at the front of her letter like she was clearing the table before setting it, removing the pretense before it could sit there and make a liar of her. He read the letter 40 times before he wrote back. He did not read it all 40 times in a row. He read it 7 times that Monday, the day it arrived, sitting at the kitchen table and then later on the porch after Noah was in bed, with the lamp beside him and the Texas night stretched out and breathing around him. He read it 3 more times on Tuesday, once in the morning and twice in the evening. He read it throughout the rest of that week, pulling it from the chest pocket of his shirt where he had taken to carrying it, reading it again in the middle of mending a water trough, reading it beside the fire on a cold Thursday night when the April temperature dropped unexpected and strange. He read it because there was something in it he kept trying to locate precisely and kept finding in a slightly different place each time. Some days it was the directness of it that held him. Some days it was the word unreasonable applied to the garden, which made something in him want to smile before he had decided to. Some days it was the last line, that spare declaration. I mean what I say. 4 words that carried more weight than entire paragraphs of other women's letters. He wrote back on a Wednesday evening, 12 days after he had received her letter. He had written 7 drafts before he was satisfied, which was more than he had written for anything in his adult life, including legal documents. He wrote, "Miss Hale, thank you for writing. I want to begin by saying that your letter was the most honest thing I have read in a very long time, and I mean that as the highest possible compliment. You said you are nothing special. I read that line more times than I will admit and found each time that I disagreed with it, though I recognize I am in no position to make that judgment based on a single letter. I will offer you the same honesty you offered me. I am a widower with a 7-year-old son named Noah who is curious and headstrong and currently obsessed with everything relating to horses, which is fortunate given that we raise them. My ranch is called Hartwell Quarter. It sits on 300 acres in Harding County, and I have run it alone since my wife Alina passed 2 years ago from a complication following childbirth. The baby did not survive either. I tell you this not to invite your sympathy, but because you said honesty at the beginning saves trouble later, and I found myself wanting to live up to that principle. I am not a man given to easy sentiment, but I found myself wanting to write back to you before I had fully decided to, which I think says something. I would very much like to continue this correspondence. Yours, Levi Hartwell." He addressed it, sealed it, and rode into Cassidy Creek the next morning to post it himself rather than waiting for Domingo's weekly supply run, which was something he noted with a private embarrassment and did not mention to Domingo, who would have found it worth mentioning for approximately the next 6 months. Abigail received his letter 8 days later. She was pulling weeds from the bean rows when she saw Chester Pratt's boy coming up the road on his speckled horse, and she wiped her hands on her apron and walked out to meet him because it was quicker than waiting. She read the letter on the porch. She read it twice, then held it on her knee and looked out at the yard where Crockett was standing under the mesquite tree with the philosophical expression of a mule who had seen many things and been moved by none of them. She had not expected him to write back. She had told herself she had not expected it, and she had almost convinced herself this was true. She went inside and read it a 3rd time at the kitchen table, and when she came to the part about Alina and the baby, she set the letter down and sat very still for a moment. There was a grief in those sentences that he had not tried to dress up or make comfortable for the reader. He had just set it down, the way she had set down her own plainness, and left it there without apology. She wrote back that evening, and that was how it began. They wrote to each other twice a month through April and May, and then the letters became more frequent without either of them deciding that they would be, the way a creek finds a new channel after a rainstorm, without deliberation, simply by the nature of the terrain. By June, they were writing weekly. By July, the letters had grown longer and stranger and more specific, the way letters do when the people writing them stop worrying about what impression they are making and start telling the truth instead. She told him about Crockett's personality, which she described as sincerely contrary. She told him about the night the roof over the bedroom had leaked during a storm, and she had moved her mattress to the kitchen and slept beside the stove and found it, to her surprise, rather cozy. She told him about her mother, who had been a reader, who had kept a small collection of books on a shelf above the fireplace that Abigail still dusted with care, though she had read them all multiple times and the spines were going. She told him about the garden's failures and small victories with a running commentary that was, without intending to be, very funny. He told her about Noah, in the specific and loving detail of a man who is both exhausted and astonished by his child. He told her about Domingo, who was originally from Chihuahua and who made a coffee so strong it was considered by everyone on the ranch to be a separate category of substance from the coffee made by anyone else. He told her about the horses, about the work of breaking and training and selling them, about the language of animals that was not words, but was still absolutely a language if you paid attention. He told her about the land, about Harding County in particular and the way the sky behaved there, and she read these descriptions and felt something she could not name but which had the quality of recognition, of somewhere she had not been but felt she somehow already knew. He did not tell her in those early letters that he had read her first letter 40 times. He carried that piece of information close, the way you carry a stone in your pocket that you are not sure yet what to do with. In July, he wrote something that kept her awake. It was not dramatic. It was a single line near the end of a letter about the horses and the summer heat and a dispute he'd had with a neighboring rancher about a shared water source. The line was, "I have come to look forward to Tuesdays more than any other day of the week, and I suspect you know why." She read that sentence 5 times before she put the letter away. She wrote back on a Tuesday. By August, there was something happening between them that neither had named. The letters had moved through the season of pleasant getting-to-know-you information and arrived somewhere more alive, more vulnerable. He asked her questions that required her to think. She asked him questions that she was slightly afraid of the answers to, which was, she was discovering a sign that she was asking the right ones. He asked her what she was afraid of. She wrote back, being ordinary. Not in the sense of living a quiet life, which I find I have no objection to, but in the sense of living it without anyone to notice the particular way I live it. I think the thing I have been most afraid of is disappearing without having been fully seen. She almost did not send that paragraph. She sat with the letter sealed for 2 days. Then she sent it. He wrote back, "I think what you are describing is not fear of being ordinary. I think it is fear of being alone, which is not the same thing at all. And I think you should know that I have noticed in 8 months of letters a great deal that is specific to you and no one else. The mule. The kitchen ceiling leak that became a cozy story. The way you describe failure without shame. You are seen, Miss Hale, at least from here." She cried a little when she read that in the good way, the way that clears something rather than breaking it. She wrote back and told him she had cried. She almost did not include that either, but she did, because dishonesty in any direction felt like a betrayal of something they had built. He wrote back, "Good. That means it landed the way it was meant to." In September, he asked if she would be willing to receive a visit. He framed it carefully, with exit ramps included, as if he understood that the question was large and wanted to make sure she could answer it however she needed to. He said he understood if it was too soon or if she preferred to continue the letters indefinitely, that he valued the correspondence on its own terms and would not want her to feel pressured. He said he had a reason to be in the area in October, a horse he was delivering to a buyer outside Millhaven, and that if she were agreeable, he might call on her rather than simply passing through the county as a stranger. She read that letter in the garden, sitting on the overturned crate she kept there. Crockett was standing nearby observing. "He wants to come," she told Crockett. Crockett expressed no opinion. She thought about it for 3 days. Then she wrote back and said yes. The 3 weeks between the letter and the day he was due to arrive were the longest 3 weeks of Abigail's adult life. She cleaned the house with a ferocity that she recognized was partly anxiety finding productive expression. She repainted the porch railing. She bribed Mrs. Dutton's nephew to fix the section of fence that had been listing since March. She pulled 3 dresses from the trunk and assessed them with new eyes, which led to a conversation with Clara Dutton about whether the blue one with the white collar was too formal and the gray one too plain, and Clara told her firmly that the blue one was suitable and that she was not, under any circumstances, to overthink this. She thought about what he looked like. His letters had not described him physically, and she had not asked, because it had seemed beside the point and she had not wanted to begin caring about it. Now she found she was curious in a way that made her feel slightly foolish. She knew he was 28, that he had dark hair from a single mention in a letter where he had described Noah as having his mother's blonde coloring, which meant Levi's was different. She knew his hands were capable from what he wrote about working the ranch. She knew he was careful and deliberate from the structure of his sentences. She knew he was capable of gentleness from how he wrote about his son. She knew, if she was honest with herself, that she was already in some trouble. The morning of his arrival, she was up before sunrise. She made biscuits she then worried were too many biscuits and indicated eagerness, then decided to leave them because she had already made them and removing biscuits would be worse than leaving them. She put on the blue dress. She braided her hair back, then took it down, then braided it again, then decided that what she did with her hair was her own business and braided it a final time and left it. She was in the garden when she heard the horse on the road. She stood up and turned. He came around the bend in the road leading one horse and riding another, and even from a distance she could see that he was tall. He sat in the saddle with the ease of someone who had been on horseback so long it was simply where he belonged, the way certain people belong in particular landscapes. As he got closer, she could see that he was, as she had inferred from the letter, dark-haired, with a build that suggested a life of physical work, broad-shouldered under his shirt, wearing a hat the color of old straw that shaded his face until he got close enough that she could see it clearly. He was not handsome in the polished way of men who know they are. He was handsome the way a well-made thing is, with some miles on it and none of the smoothness worn off yet. He pulled up at the fence and swung down from the horse in one easy motion that she tried not to watch with as much attention as she did. He took his hat off. She saw that his eyes were dark, somewhere between brown and something she didn't have a word for. They were looking at her with the same attention she had imagined he gave to everything, deliberate and genuine. "Miss Hale," he said. "Mr. Hartwell," she said. There was a pause that was either very comfortable or very charged, and she could not immediately decide which. He said, "You have a fine mule." She looked at Crockett, who was in the corner of the fence line looking at Levi with an expression of profound skepticism. "He is contrarily fine," she said, and something relaxed between them at once. He smiled. It did something to her face against her will. He stayed for 3 hours that afternoon, sitting on the porch with the coffee she made and talking in the way that people talk when they have been writing to each other for months, and the letters have done the hard clearing work, so that when they finally speak face to face there is an ease that has already been earned. They talked about the horses he was delivering and the buyer outside town, a man named Garfield who apparently had a reputation for being very particular about confirmation. They talked about the garden. He helped her, without being asked, carry a sack of grain from the wagon she'd left by the gate to the barn, which she appreciated more than she would have said. They talked about Noah, and his face when he talked about his son had a quality of open love that she found more impressive than anything else about him. When he stood to leave, he stood for a moment looking at her with an expression she couldn't read, or perhaps could read but was not ready to name. "I am very glad," he said, "that you wrote back." "I almost didn't," she admitted. "I know," he said. "I read between the lines." She stood at the fence and watched him ride away leading the second horse, and when he had gone around the bend she stood there for another few seconds in the late afternoon light with her hand on the fence post and something very large happening quietly inside her. Mrs. Dutton arrived the next morning wanting every detail. Abigail provided a selective account and kept the fence post moment to herself. He wrote 4 days later. The letter was shorter than usual but carried more weight per word, the way things do when the writer is choosing carefully. He wrote, "I have been thinking since Millhaven that words on paper are one thing and that seeing a person is another, and that in this case the seeing confirmed what the words had already told me, which I did not expect quite so thoroughly. I am not certain how to proceed from here in a way that is fair to you and honest to myself without overstepping. I will say only this. I would like to see you again, if you are willing, under fewer time pressures and with more purpose." She read that last phrase several times. More purpose. She understood what it meant. He was not being indirect. He was being careful, which she had come to understand was his particular form of respect. She wrote back the same evening. "I am willing," she wrote, "and I am not a woman who says so lightly." She knew, even as she sealed it, that she had just agreed to something. She was glad. The letters continued through October and into November, but they were different now. There was a warmth in them that the earlier letters had approached but not fully entered. He wrote things that made her catch her breath. She wrote things back that surprised her with their honesty, things she had not known she was going to say until she was already saying them. He told her that since Aliner's death he had been functionally fine in the way that means moving through days with competence and without real living, the way a clock keeps time without anyone in the room. He told her that her letters had started making the room feel inhabited again. He did not belabor this. He said it once directly, and moved on to something about a fence repair, and she thought that was exactly right. She told him about a night the previous winter when the loneliness had been so complete. She had sat at the kitchen table until 3 in the morning because going to bed meant being alone in the dark with it, and that instead she had lit the lamp and read her mother's copy of a poetry collection until the sky went gray at the edges. She told him she was not sure why she was telling him that. He wrote back that he was glad she had. In November he asked if he might come to Millhaven again, this time not on the way to somewhere else, and stay in town for a few days so that they might spend more time together, with Mrs. Dutton or another neighbor present as propriety required, since he was mindful of her reputation in the community. She smiled at that when she read it. She showed that particular line to Clara Dutton, who called him a gentleman and looked very pleased with herself. He came in the second week of November. He stayed at the boarding house in Millhaven run by a woman named Mrs. Prescott, who charged fair rates and kept excellent order and also served the best pie in the county, a fact Levi mentioned in his next letter with the kind of enthusiasm that she found entirely charming. He was there for 4 days. They walked. They talked. Mrs. Dutton chaperoned with more enthusiasm than was strictly necessary, occasionally managing to position herself at a distance that was technically present but practically absent, which Abigail suspected was intentional and felt grateful for without saying so. On the second day of his visit, they walked to the edge of her property where the old pine tree had split from the lightning bolt in April, the same day his letter had arrived. She told him about that. He stood looking at the split tree with his hands in his pockets. "The same day," he said. "The same day," she said. He looked at her, and there was something in his face that she had been reading toward for months through paper and ink, and was now reading directly without the page between them, and it was the same thing. It was exactly the same thing. "Abigail," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She had thought about this moment, the first name moment, in the abstract. She had not been prepared for how it would feel, which was like a door opening in a house you had been circling for a long time. "Yes," she said, because she knew what he was going to say and she meant to answer it before he finished, because she did not want there to be a single second in which he was unsure. He looked at her. He understood that she had answered something he hadn't asked yet. "You are sure," he said. "I told you," she said. "I am not a woman who says so lightly." He took her hand. They stood there by the split tree in the November light that was thin and gold and specific to that season in that place, and she felt his hand warm around hers, and this was not particularly dramatic in the way of stories, which she understood later was why it was so real. On the third day of his visit, he sat with her at the kitchen table after supper and laid out, with the same care he brought to everything, what he was proposing and what it would mean. He said he had been thinking carefully. He said he was not a man who made decisions lightly or reversed them, and she should know that going in. He said that what he was asking was significant, that it meant her leaving Millhaven and coming to Harding County, that it meant a new home and Noah and the ranch, and he wanted her to walk into that with full knowledge rather than romantic blur. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "I know." "You're not worried," he said. "Of course I'm worried," she said. "I'm also certain." There was a moment where he just looked at her, and she thought she could see something unlocking in him that had been very tightly held for a long time. "I wrote back to 11 letters," he said. "I read yours 40 times before I wrote back to it." She looked at him. 40, he confirmed without apology. She was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. 40 times. He had read her letter 40 times, the letter in which she had said she was nothing special. "What were you looking for?" she asked. "I kept finding something different each time," he said. "I think I was trying to figure out what it was that made me keep going back. I eventually decided I didn't need to name it. I just needed to write back." She thought about the 4 drafts she had written before the final letter. She thought about the drawer that stuck. She thought about walking to Chester Pratt's post office before she could change her mind. "We were both," she said, "rather careful with this." "Yes," he said. "I think that is a good sign," she said. "So do I," he said. He proposed formally on the 4th day of his visit, the morning he was due to ride back to Harding County. He did it simply, without the elaborate staging she had sometimes imagined such moments contained. He did it on the porch, with Crockett visible in the background looking at the proceedings with his customary skepticism, and she said yes in a voice that was entirely steady, because she had said yes already in every direction, and it was simply a matter of making it official. He kissed her for the first time then, which was also on the porch, and was not the kind of thing she would have described to anyone but which she would remember precisely forever. He rode away that morning with her answer in his pocket and a letter to write, and she stood at the fence again in the November light, and this time she was smiling. Mrs. Dutton came over within the hour. She had been watching from her window. "Well?" she said. "Yes," said Abigail. Clara Dutton made a sound of profound satisfaction and hugged her so hard the braid came loose. The winter between the engagement and the wedding was busy in a way that left little room for the loneliness that had been Abigail's companion for the past 2 years. There were arrangements to make, letters to write to Levi's family in Dallas and her few remaining distant relatives, practical considerations about the property, what to sell, what to keep, what could be transported 3 counties north on a wagon. There was the question of Crockett, which Levi settled by saying immediately, without hesitation, that of course Crockett would come, said with the calm certainty of a man who understood that this mule was non-negotiable. She loved him a little more for that. She wrote to him in December and told him she was glad he had said that about Crockett without her having to ask. He wrote back, "I figured Crockett came with the deal. I am prepared. Domingo is less prepared, but he will adapt." She also had to think about Noah. She thought about Noah a great deal. She had read about him in so many letters that she felt she knew him, but knowing someone through another person's love-colored descriptions was not the same as being the person who walked into a 7-year-old boy's house and became part of his daily life. A boy who had lost his mother at 5 years old. A boy who deserved patience and consistency, and someone who would not perform caring but actually do it. She wrote to Levi about this honestly. He wrote back with equal honesty. He said Noah knew about the letters. He said Noah had asked if the lady in Millhaven was nice, and Levi had told him she seemed to be very nice indeed, and Noah had asked what she smelled like, which was, Levi noted, the kind of question that said a great deal about how children assess the world. He said he had told Noah that he was going to meet her properly before spring, and Noah had accepted this with the reserve of a child who had learned that getting attached to things quickly was sometimes costly. Abigail read that last part and sat with it for a while. She began making Noah a pair of warm socks out of good wool. She was an adequate knitter, not exceptional, but she knitted those socks with care and sent them in the December letter with a note addressed to Noah himself that said, "Your father tells me you are interested in horses. I would very much like to hear about them from you directly, if you are willing. My name is Abigail, and I look forward to meeting you. Enclosed are socks because it is cold up in Harding County, and your father forgot to mention whether you have warm enough ones." Levi wrote back that Noah had read the note 3 times and had immediately put the socks on and worn them to supper, and had then written, under his father's supervision, a letter that ran to approximately half a page and concerned entirely a horse named Major, who was a bay gelding of apparently outstanding character. She wrote back to Noah separately, and so began a second correspondence. The wedding took place in February of 1883 in Cassidy Creek, which was the town nearest the Hartwell Quarter Ranch. It was a small ceremony in a whitewashed church. Levi's brother Daniel came from Dallas with his wife and their 2 daughters. Levi's ranch hand Domingo stood with him, having been presented with this role with such matter-of-fact certainty by Levi that Domingo had simply accepted it with a solemnity that suggested he understood the weight of it. Clara Dutton made the journey north with Chester Pratt's wife for company, and arrived at the boarding house in Cassidy Creek with the peach preserves she'd brought as a gift and an expression of absolute vindication. Abigail wore the blue dress with the white collar, which she had let out slightly at the waist and pressed until it had no opinion left about anything. She carried a small bunch of dried wildflowers because fresh ones were not available in February in Texas, which she found suitable. She walked into the church and saw Levi standing at the front, and something that had been slightly held, slightly braced, in her chest for the past months released like a knot coming undone. He was looking at her. He was looking at her the way she had read toward through all those letters, which was to say, completely. Without the social arrangement of looking at someone because they are the bride and you are expected to. Looking at her specifically. At her. She held that look across the length of the church and felt seen in the way she had been afraid she never would be. The ceremony was not long. The minister was a practical man. The vows were the traditional ones, which she found she meant entirely. When it was done, Levi took her hand in both of his, which was not part of the ceremony, simply something he did, and she thought that was better than most things in the ceremony. Noah was present in the front pew in his good coat and his wool socks, though the wool socks were not visible. She had met him the day before properly, for the first time, in the parlor of the boarding house. He had been watchful in the way children are when they are deciding something important. He had looked at her with dark eyes that were Levi's eyes in miniature, and she had looked back without trying to be charming, because she understood instinctively that charming was not what this child needed. What he needed was consistent. She had sat down at his level and said, "You wrote me a very good letter about Major. Is he as good a horse as you described?" He had thought about this seriously. "Better," he had said. "I would like to see him," she had said. "Tomorrow," he had said, which was the day of the wedding, but she chose to understand it in the general sense of soon. She had seen Major 2 days after the wedding when they returned to the ranch, and she had been introduced to him by Noah with all the gravity of a diplomatic occasion, and she had paid proper attention to Major, who was indeed a fine horse, and Noah had watched her closely and something in him had shifted incrementally in the direction of trust. That was, she understood, how it would go with him, not all at once, incrementally. She was prepared for that. She was, as Levi had once read from her letter, a woman who meant what she said. The ranch was larger than she had imagined from the letters. 300 acres of Texas grassland, with a house that was solidly built, 2 stories, with a proper kitchen and a parlor and 4 bedrooms. It had been built by Levi's father and expanded by Levi himself. It was not a fine house by city standards, but it was a good house, with thick walls and deep windows and a porch that wrapped the front and one side, and had a view of the plains that in the right light was something she could not find adequate words for. She had walked out onto that porch on her first morning and stood in the cold February air watching the light come up, and Levi had appeared behind her with 2 cups of coffee, which he held out without saying anything. She took the cup. They stood there together watching the morning organize itself. "What do you think?" he said. "I think," she said, "that I am going to be very happy here." She could feel him beside her settle into something. She was not wrong. Happiness was not, she discovered, the simple bright thing she had imagined it might be at the age of 17, before grief and labor and the particular education of living alone had complicated her understanding of what things were. Happiness was not simple. It was woven through with work and difficulty, and the ordinary friction of two people building a shared life from separate histories. But it was real. The first months of the marriage had the quality of discovering a new terrain in the company of someone who was learning it alongside you. They had known each other through letters for nearly a year, but the domestic intimacy of shared space was a different kind of knowing, and they were both adjusting. He was accustomed to running the house and the ranch on his own schedule, in his own way, and she was accustomed to complete independence of a more austere kind. There were moments of friction, small collisions of habit and expectation. There was the week in March when he rearranged the kitchen storage without mentioning it because he thought it would be more practical, and she came into the kitchen looking for the flour and couldn't find it, and had to ask, and the asking felt like more than it was, felt like something about whose space this was and whose word was final, and she told him so, not sharply but clearly, and he listened, and then they talked about it, and he did not grow defensive and she did not back away from it. And at the end of that conversation they had, with some irony, a better system than either of them had had before. There was the evening in April when she overheard him telling Domingo that she was managing the adjustment well, said with genuine admiration, but in a tone that implied he had been watching to see, and she had felt a flash of something that was half pride and half irritation, because she was not adjusting to this life so much as building it alongside him, and there was a difference. She told him that too. He had thought about it and said she was right and thanked her for saying so, and then asked if she wanted to ride out to look at the north pasture with him, which was his way of moving from difficult to forward. She was learning his language. He was learning hers. This, she decided, was what being married actually was, the extended project of learning to read someone in 3 dimensions rather than 2. Spring came in with warmth and purpose. The land greened up in the particular way of Texas rangeland, which was not the lush excess of wetter climates but something sparser and more deliberate, as if the grass understood it had to be efficient. She started a kitchen garden on the south side of the house, with more success than she'd had in Millhaven, partly because the soil was slightly better and partly because Domingo, who had strong opinions about growing things, had given her specific advice she had actually followed. Domingo was, she discovered, one of the more important presences in their life. He had been with the ranch for 6 years and with Levi's life for somewhat longer than that, in the sense of being the kind of constant that shapes everything around it. He was a compact, watchful man of 40 with a dark mustache and a dry humor that took some weeks to calibrate. He had been politely reserved with her at first, in a way she recognized as the reserve of someone who had watched over a household through a hard time and was not yet sure what this new thing meant for it. She had approached this directly, because direct was her nature, and had told him plainly that she understood his position and that she was not arriving to disrupt anything that had held this place together. He had looked at her for a moment and then nodded with a seriousness that told her they understood each other. After that, they got along well, and eventually very well, in the way of people who have established their respective territories and feel secure within them. Noah progressed in his own time. He was a child who did not rush, which she came to understand was both a trait and a defense. She did not push. She was present, consistently present in the mornings when he came down for breakfast, in the evenings when he did his lessons at the kitchen table, on the weekends when he wanted to show her things about the horses or the ranch. She answered his questions when he asked them. She taught him, when he expressed interest, how to make biscuits, which he regarded with the gravity of a scientific experiment. She did not attempt to mother him with performance. She simply did the things that needed doing and let him observe. In May, he came to her without being asked and sat beside her while she was reading on the porch, and asked if she would read to him. She read to him for an hour. He fell asleep in the chair beside her with the warmth of the evening on his face, and she sat for a while looking at him and feeling something that she did not have a precise word for but which had the quality and temperature of love. She told Levi that evening. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her in the lamplight, and then he said, "Thank you." She understood exactly what he meant. She said, "He is a good boy." "He is," Levi said. "He is so much better than I am at most things, and he has no idea." She laughed at that because it was both funny and entirely true, and Levi smiled at the laugh in that way he had of smiling at specific things she did, as if cataloging them. Summer was hard in the practical sense. Texas in the summer of 1883 was dry and demanding, the kind of season that tested people's resources and patience in equal measure. There was a stretch of 6 weeks in June and July without significant rain that pressured the water situation on the ranch. Levi was up before dawn every morning and sometimes not in until after dark, and she understood this was the nature of the work and supported it without complaint. But she also watched him coming in exhausted and told him clearly when she thought he was driving himself past the productive point, and he listened to her when she said so, which she found was one of the things she was most grateful for in him. He actually listened. She took on more of the household management during those weeks, and also, with Domingo's guidance, more of the practical ranch work that did not require heavy labor, keeping records, managing the feed inventory, coordinating with the buyer's agents who came through monthly. She had an aptitude for this she had not known she possessed, a capacity for organized thought that had been somewhat wasted on the smaller scale of her Millhaven operation. Levi noticed. He told her directly that she was good at it, and asked if she would want to take on the bookkeeping permanently. She said yes, because she was good at it and it mattered to the operation of the thing they were building together, and because she liked being good at things and useful in ways that were genuinely required. There was an incident in July that gave her a week of worry she would not wish to repeat. A man named Garfield Tate, who was one of the neighboring ranchers, and had an old grievance with Levi over a property boundary dispute that had been settled legally but apparently not emotionally, came to the ranch on a hot Wednesday afternoon in a belligerent mood, and a state of having been drinking since morning. He was not violent, but he was loud and unreasonable, and had 2 men with him who seemed to be there to provide audience, and Levi came out to deal with it, and there was a very tense 45 minutes on the front of the property. She had taken Noah inside and kept him there calmly, playing a card game at the kitchen table while she kept one ear on what was happening outside. Domingo had positioned himself near the barn, with the studied neutrality of a man who was ready if necessary and hoping not to be. The situation resolved when the county sheriff, who happened to be passing the road on his way back from the neighboring spread, stopped to see what the noise was about and made his presence known, and Garfield Tate made the calculation that a continued performance had more downside than up, and removed himself with the sputtering exit of a man who had more temper than strategy. After he left, she had come out and stood beside Levi, who was looking down the road where Tate had gone with an expression that was controlled but not particularly at ease. "That was handled well," she said. He looked at her sideways. "You were watching." "I was aware," she said. "There is a difference." He nearly smiled. "The land issue is genuinely resolved," he said. "The legal matter, he simply does not accept it. Some men don't accept things they have lost," she said, "even when they should." "No," Levi said. "They don't." She took his arm briefly, the way she had begun to take his arm when she wanted him to know she was beside him, and they went back inside. The incident was not repeated. Garfield Tate continued to be a distant source of low-grade irritation in the way of certain unresolvable neighborhood conflicts, but he did not come to the ranch again. By August, the dry stretch broke with 3 days of rain that fell steady and generous over Harding County, and the whole ranch seemed to breathe out. The evening after the first full day of rain, they sat on the porch together and watched the sky clear to a dark, precise blue and the first stars appear, and Noah sat between them on the porch step, and nobody said very much, but it was the most contented silence she had been part of in years. She reached for Levi's hand. He took it. Noah, after a moment, leaned slightly against her arm, She did not make anything of it. She simply did not move. Levi saw, she knew he saw, neither of them said anything. That night after Noah was in bed and the house was quiet, Levi found her in the parlor where she was writing in the journal she'd started since moving to the ranch, a habit she had taken up as a replacement for the letters she no longer needed to write. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her in the lamplight. She looked up. He said, "I need to tell you something." She set the journal aside, something in his voice. He came in and sat across from her, with the deliberateness of a man who has been composing something. "When Alina died," he said, "I was certain that the best I could do from that point was function, take care of Noah, run the ranch, be present in the ways that were required. I had concluded, I think, that the other things, the larger things, were finished for me. I was not unhappy about it particularly. It was simply what I believed was true." He was looking at her with those eyes that she had learned to read over months and miles of paper. "I was wrong," he said. She said nothing because this did not need her to fill it. "You are," he said, "in every way that matters, extraordinary. I want you to know that. Because you said in that first letter that you were nothing special, and I disagreed with it when I read it, and I have disagreed with it more specifically with every passing month, and I think someone ought to tell you clearly, without qualification, that they are wrong and you are remarkable." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "You read it 40 times. "I did," he said. "So you knew even then," she said. "I suspected," he said. "I know now." She stood up from the chair and crossed the room, which was 4 steps, and he stood at the same time, and they met in the middle of the parlor under the lamplight, and she put her hands on his face, which she had found she liked to do, and he put his arms around her, and she said against his shoulder, "I love you, Levi Hartwell." She had said it before, over the months since the wedding, in the ordinary ways of married life. But this time it was a full sentence, deliberate and specific, and he held it the way he held everything she said, with complete attention. "I love you," he said, "Abigail Hale Hartwell." She laughed a little at the full name. He was the only person who used it like that, with all 3 parts, as if her whole history was included. She stayed in his arms for a long moment, with the rain-cleaned air coming through the window and the lamp making its small, warm circle in the room, and thought about the letter in the kitchen drawer that stuck, and the walk to Chester Pratt's, and the 40 readings she had not known about, and all the ways that things had moved toward this particular night in this particular room. There were many things she would think, looking back. But one of the things she would think most consistently was that the most consequential decision of her life had been the one she had almost not made, and that she was very glad she had shouldered it open, the way she shouldered the stuck drawer, and sent the thing into the world. In October, she learned she was expecting a child. She told Levi on a Saturday morning. She had gone back and forth on how, whether to make something of the occasion or simply say it, and ultimately she chose simply to say it, because that was who she was and he knew it, and it would have been strange to be otherwise. She said, "I believe we are expecting a baby." He went very still. She watched his face carefully because she understood the particular complication of this information for a man whose previous child had cost him his wife. She saw the complication move through him like a current, and she waited. He crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands and looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Are you frightened?" "A little," she said. "Are you?" "A little," he said. "Yes." "Good," she said. "We'll be frightened together then." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else. He held her very carefully, as if she were already more precious than usual. "You'll tell me," he said. "Whatever you need, whatever the doctor says. You'll tell me." "I'll tell you everything," she said. "I always do." He held her face and looked at her. "You are everything right in my life," he said very quietly, and she believed him entirely. They rode to see Dr. Aldous in Cassidy Creek that week, who was a capable and reassuring man of 50 with considerable experience and a calm manner that was worth more than his medical credentials in the currency of anxiety. He confirmed the pregnancy and gave them the practical information, and told Abigail, who was 25 and strong and healthy, that he saw no reason for particular concern, while also being honest about what to watch for, which she appreciated. They drove home in the wagon in the October afternoon, and Noah was waiting for them, because he had been told something important was being discussed, and he sat in the parlor with the watchful expression he still sometimes wore, the one that carried the memory of losses he had been too young to process fully. Levi sat down and told him directly. He did not soften it into something unrecognizable. He said that Abigail was going to have a baby in the spring, a brother or sister for Noah. Noah was quiet for a moment. He looked at Abigail. "Will you be all right?" he asked. She had not expected that question, not the directness of it, not from him, and she understood immediately what it meant and why he was asking it, and she felt something move in her that was both grief for what this boy had been through and something fierce and protective. She looked at him steadily and said, "Yes, Noah, I'm going to be all right." He held her gaze for a moment, assessing, and then nodded in the precise way he had of accepting information he had decided to trust. "Good," he said. Then, after a pause, "Is it going to take Major Stahl?" She blinked, and then she laughed and Levi laughed, and Noah, after a moment, smiled the smile he had that was his father's in miniature. "No," she said, "the baby will not take Major Stahl." "Good," said Noah, and got up and went back outside, which was all he needed on the subject at that time. The pregnancy moved through winter with the particular quality of a season spent in anticipation. She was not a woman who found pregnancy easy in the way of the women in stories, who glowed and drifted. She was tired in the early months, and then less tired, and found that the work of the ranch and the house was actually helpful to her, keeping her occupied and physically in motion in ways that suited her constitution. She had a brief, difficult stretch in January when the cold was bad and she was not sleeping well, and Levi responded by making no fuss about it but simply adjusting, getting up with her when she was restless, making the kitchen warm in the middle of the night, sitting with her and reading or talking in the lamplit dark until she was ready to sleep again. She watched him do these things and thought about the man in the letters, the widower running a 300-acre ranch with the contained competence of someone who had learned not to need things, and thought about how wrong it was that strength was so often confused with the absence of tenderness, when in fact the truest strength she had ever seen was exactly this. A man who got up in the cold dark without complaint because someone he loved could not sleep. She told him this. He said, "It is not anything special." She looked at him sharply, and he caught himself and recognized immediately what he had said. "I suppose," he said, with a slight color in his face, "that we have established that we are both unreliable judges of what is special." She smiled at him. "We have." The baby came in April in the first week, as the spring was beginning its considered return to the Texas plains. Dr. Aldous came from Cassidy Creek, and Clara Dutton had made the journey north 2 weeks prior to be present, which Abigail had asked for, and Clara had agreed to with the promptness of a woman who had been waiting to be asked. The labor was long, which she had expected. She was not a woman who hid from difficulty, and she went through it with the same quality she brought to everything, present and effortful, with Levi nearby in the way that the doctor permitted, which was not in the room itself but close enough that she could hear him when she needed to, and she called his name twice during the hardest part, not for rescue but for anchoring. The baby was a boy. He was handed to her in the gray early morning light, and she looked at him, this entirely new person who had not existed until this moment, and felt something that she could not have prepared for, which is to say she felt everything all at once, without order or priority. Levi came in. He stood at the edge of the room and looked at her holding the baby, and she saw his face do something complicated and then settle into something that was the clearest expression of love she had ever seen on a human face. He came to her side. He looked at his son. "He is all right," he said. "He is perfect," she said. He touched the baby's head with one finger very gently, and she watched his face while he did it. "What will you name him?" She asked because she had told him months ago that she wanted him to have a voice in the name. "I thought," he said, "Thomas, her father's name, Thomas Hale." She had not told him that was her father's name, and he knew it anyway, because she had written about him in the letters, about the pine tree and the pneumonia and the 12 stubborn acres, and he had remembered, and he had carried it forward into this moment. She felt the tears come without being able to stop them and did not try. "Thomas," she said. "Thomas Hartwell," he said. Noah came in a while later, led by Clara Dutton, who managed the moment with the expertise of someone who understood that children needed to enter significant situations at a pace they could manage. He stood at the edge of the bed with his serious face and looked at the baby, who was very small and very red and making a small continuous sound. "He is loud," Noah said. "He will get louder," Abigail said. "Is he always going to be like this?" Noah asked. "For a while," she said. "And then he'll be different and then different again. He'll keep changing on you." Noah considered this. "Like horses," he said. "Somewhat like horses," she agreed. Noah reached out and touched the baby's hand with one finger, just as his father had. Thomas's fingers closed around Noah's, which was a reflex but which Noah received with an expression of absolute wonder, as if he had not expected to matter to this new person and found that he did. He looked up at Abigail with that dark, careful gaze. "He knows me," he said. She looked at him. 8 years old, this boy who had lost so much and received it all so quietly. "Of course he knows you," she said. "You're his brother." Something shifted in Noah's face that was enormous and silent and took a moment to settle. He nodded once. He stepped back and looked at Levi, who was watching him, and then he went a stand beside his father, which was where he stood when things were significant, and Levi put his hand on his son's shoulder, and Noah put his hand over his father's hand briefly in the way he sometimes did, which was his equivalent of saying something large. They stayed like that for a moment, the four of them in the morning light, while Clara Dutton made herself tactfully busy in the corner, and Thomas Hartwell continued to announce himself to the world. The months after Thomas's birth settled into a life that was full in every direction Abigail valued. The ranch grew. Levi expanded the horse operation in the second year of their marriage, taking on an additional hand named Prescott Crane, a laconic young man of 22 from eastern Texas who had a particular gift with difficult horses and very little to say about anything else, which Domingo accepted philosophically and Noah found fascinating. The horse operation developed a reputation in the region that brought buyers from farther than Harding County, and Levi's work was reflected in the accounts Abigail kept, which she watched with satisfaction because she had come to understand this operation in specific and intimate terms and what it meant for all of them. She would note privately, rather good at the business side of the ranch. Better, Levi told her without equivocation, than he was himself. He said this without any sense of threat to his dignity, which was one of the things about him that she catalogued with continuous appreciation. He had no interest in false credit. He wanted things done well. He was glad when she did them well and said so. She expanded the garden in the second year, convincing Domingo to help her reclaim a section of ground near the south fence that had been going to weeds. Domingo agreed with the philosophical expression of a man who knows he is going to do something anyway and prefers to agree gracefully. The garden that emerged was by any measure a success, producing enough vegetables through the summer to supplement the kitchen substantially, and enough to preserve for winter. Thomas grew into his name. By his first birthday, he was pulling himself up on the furniture and looking at the world with the bright, focused attention that suggested he had opinions about everything and was collecting information before he delivered them. He looked like Abigail in the line of his jaw, and like Levi in his eyes, and like neither of them particularly in the round determination of his expression. Noah took his role as elder brother seriously in the way he took everything seriously, which meant that Thomas was supervised with consistency and taught things at the first possible opportunity, and that Noah came to Abigail and Levi in the evenings with reports about Thomas's progress in crawling or standing or recognizing his own name, delivered with the earnest precision of a boy who had decided to be genuinely invested. She watched Noah grow and change through the second year, the slow opening of a child who had been closed by experience, and she thought sometimes about that first letter, the one she had almost not sent, and traced the line from that moment to this one, to Noah in the yard showing his brother a beetle he had found, to the sound of Levi's voice reading in the parlor, to the specific quality of this life that she had stumbled into by being, one Thursday evening, brave enough to be honest. 2 years after Thomas was born, she was expecting again. She told Levi on a Sunday morning, this time on the porch with the coffee he had made, watching the morning light do what it did in that particular landscape, which was still, after 2.5 years, something she found it worth stopping to observe. He received the news with the greater ease of a man who had done this before and survived it, which did not mean he was not moved, only that the movement was quieter and more assured. He said, "Another Thomas or something new." "Something new," she said, "if it turns out that way." The second child arrived in the autumn and was a girl. They named her Me after Abigail's mother. She was small and very serious from the first moment, with a line between her brows that suggested she was assessing everything and would deliver her verdict in due course. Noah, at 10 years old, received Me with the warmth of a boy who had by now practiced caring for someone smaller than himself, and found he had a capacity for it he had not expected. Thomas, at 2, received Me with a friendly possessiveness that had to be managed carefully but came from the right place. The winter Me was born was one of the good ones, cold and clear, with enough snow to make the mornings beautiful and enough warmth in the house to make the evenings complete. Levi had added a proper heating stove in the parlor the previous year, which made a considerable difference, and Domingo had moved from the bunkhouse to a small separate room off the kitchen that Levi had built for him, which Domingo accepted with the same solemnity he had brought to everything significant, and which signaled, if anyone had been unclear, that he was family. She sat on the porch one December evening, wearing Levi's heavy coat over her own and with Me in her arms, and watched the snow that had fallen that day reflecting the last light of the sky. The house was warm behind her. She could hear Noah inside reading to Thomas, which had become an evening ritual that Noah had established entirely on his own initiative, and which she found so exactly right that she had never commented on it for fear of making it self-conscious. Levi came out and sat beside her. She said, "Do you remember what you wrote in one of the early letters about being like a clock that kept time without anyone in the room?" "I remember," he said. "The room is rather full now," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the snow. "Yes," he said, "it is." He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and Me slept in her arms with the particular completeness of new babies, who do not yet know enough to be anywhere else but present. She thought about the woman she had been in Millhaven, alone in the dry summer with the stuck drawer and the contrarily disposed mule, and the letter she had written and almost not sent. She thought about that woman with great tenderness, the way you regard a younger self who did not know what was coming. She had written that she was nothing special, and she had believed it when she wrote it, the kind of belief that comes not from genuine assessment but from long absence of evidence to the contrary. She had been wrong, not in the way he had told her she was wrong, with the generous revision of love, though that had mattered and would always matter. She had been wrong in the original fact of it. She was not nothing special. She was exactly this, a woman who told the truth when truth was difficult, who worked without complaint but would not work without acknowledgement, who had walked toward a life she could not see clearly and kept going because she had decided to mean what she said. A woman who had built something from words on paper, who had written a letter in the honest belief that it might be nothing, and had made of it everything she had. She held Me a little closer. Levi looked at her. In the winter dark his face had the quality it had when he was thinking something he was about to say. "What?" she said. "I was thinking," he said, "about something I never told you." "Tell me now," she said. "The first time I read your letter," he said, the very first time I read the line where you said you were nothing special, and I put the letter down and picked it back up and read it again. And I thought, here is a woman who thinks she has to lead with her deficiencies to be fair to whoever's reading. And I thought, that is either the most defeated thing I have ever read or the most honest, and I couldn't tell which, so I read it again. She looked at him. 40 times later, he said, I had decided it was the most honest, and that the most honest was the most beautiful, and I was right. She sat with that for a moment in the cold air with the sleeping baby and the snow and the sound of her boys inside and the particular permanence of this life she had made. You should have told me earlier, she said. I know, he said. I was reading it about 37 times before I was sure. She laughed, there in the cold December dark, and he smiled at the laugh, and me stirred slightly in her arms and then settled again. And inside the house Noah's voice continued to read and Thomas's voice asked a question about whatever it was he was hearing. And Abigail Hale Hartwell sat on her porch under the winter sky and felt the full weight of a good life pressing gently and exactly around her. She had written, in a letter on a Thursday evening by lamplight, that she was nothing special. He had read it 40 times before he wrote back. And in the writing back, they had together made something that she could not have named or imagined from the kitchen table in Millhaven, something that had no adequate description except to say that it was real, and warm, and solid as the land they had built it on, and hers, and his, and theirs, completely. Crockett lived for another 7 years after the move to Harding County, which the veterinarian who came through once a year called remarkable and which Domingo called stubbornness, and which Noah called loyalty. When Crockett finally stopped peacefully, on a July morning in the mesquite shade, Noah and Thomas helped bury him in the south corner of the pasture where the old mule had spent his summers standing in the precise quality of shade that suited him, and they marked the place with a flat stone that Thomas, at 7 years old, selected with great seriousness from the creek bed. Me, at 5, stood beside her mother at the graveside with her small, serious face and said, "Will he be all right?" It was the same question Noah had asked in a different context years ago. Abigail looked at her daughter. "Yes," she said, "he will be very all right." She took me's hand, and Noah stood on her other side, and Levi stood beside her with his hand at the small of her back in the way he had always placed it when he wanted her to know without words that he was there. And Thomas stood beside his father looking at the stone with 7-year-old gravity, and the mesquite shade moved gently in the summer breeze, and the ranch spread out around them in the warm particular morning, and everything was, in the truest and most complete sense, all right. She had written that she was nothing special. He had read it 40 times. And they had, together and with great care, made a life that was extraordinary in all the ways that actually counted, which is to say not in grandness or reputation or the large gestures of legend, but in the specific accumulated weight of days well lived and love well tended and truth told first, before pretense could get comfortable, because honesty at the beginning saves a great deal of trouble later. She had been right about that. She had been right about nearly everything, once she had been brave enough to say what she meant. And on the porch in the evenings, with the Texas sky doing what it did in all its seasons, with Levi beside her and the house full and warm behind them, she was, without qualification or caveat, the most herself she had ever been, and more loved than she had believed possible on a Thursday night in Millhaven when she had picked up a pen and decided, against the better advice of the careful part of her, to tell the truth and see what happened. What happened was this. All of it, every last fine and ordinary and particular day of it, this was what happened.